The underlying cause of failure for many startups is that the founders are afraid of discomfort. An environment where everyone is comfortable is unlikely to be an environment where personal growth and value creation is occurring. When you are in a startup, calibrating the right amount of discomfort is often about calibrating risk. What are your risks? Can you quantify them? Can you enumerate them? Multiplying out the probability of surviving each of those risks, then multiplying that number times the sum of the discounted future cash flows of your business will give you the expected value of your business. Under the right circumstances, entrepreneurship has much higher expected value than a stable engineering job. The important difference is variance. Your business needs to be able to withstand the variance that bad luck can provide. And entrepreneurs themselves need to be able to withstand the variance implied by the fact that their business can completely fail and go to zero. And it's really that variance that is the source of so much discomfort. Leo Polovets is a partner with Sousa Ventures. He worked as an early engineer at LinkedIn, Google, and Factual, and he blogs at Coding VC. That's at codingvc.com. In this episode, we talked about the proper mindset for founding a company, how to think about risk, mistakes, discomfort, and finances. If you like this episode, we've done many other shows with venture capitalists, including Chris Dixon and Tomas Tungus. You can download the Software Engineering Daily app for iOS to easily find all of our old episodes and discover new topics that might interest you. If you want to contribute to the Software Engineering Daily app ecosystem, you can go to github.com/softwareengineeringdaily. We've got several different projects. We've got a recommendation system, we've got the iOS app, we've got an Android app, and we've got a web front end, all of which could use your help if you're interested in creating a better Software Engineering Daily ecosystem. We want to create and organize technical content about software, and we could use your help. So with that, let's get on with this episode, an interview with Leo Polovets. Who do you use for log management? I want to tell you about Scalyr, the first purpose-built log management tool on the market. Most tools on the market utilize text indexing search, and this is great for indexing a book, for example. But if you want to search logs at scale, fast, it breaks down. Scalyr built their own database from scratch, and the system is fast. Most of the searches take less than a second. In fact, 99% of the queries execute in less than a second. That's why companies like OKCupid and Giphy and CareerBuilder use Scalyr to build their log management systems. You can try it today, free, for 90 days if you go to the promo URL, which is softwareengineeringdaily.com/Scalyr, Scalyr. That's softwareengineeringdaily.com/Scalyr. Scalyr was built by one of the founders of Writely, which is the company that became Google Docs. And if you know anything about Google Docs history, it was quite transformational when the product came out. This was a consumer-grade UI product that solved many distributed systems problems and had great scalability, which is why it turned into Google Docs. And so the founder of Writely is now turning his focus to log management. And it has the consumer-grade UI. It has the scalability that you would expect from somebody who built Google Docs. And you can use Scalyr to monitor key metrics. You can use it to trigger alerts. It's got integration with PagerDuty. And it's really easy to use. It's really lightning fast. And you can get a free 90-day trial by signing up at softwareengineeringdaily.com/SCALYR. softwareengineeringdaily.com/Scalyr. And I really recommend trying it out. I've heard from multiple companies on the show that they use Scalyr, and it's been a real differentiator for them. So check out Scalyr, and thanks to Scalyr for being a new sponsor of Software Engineering Daily. Leo Polovets is a partner at Sousa Ventures. Leo, welcome to Software Engineering Daily.
Thanks, Jeff. It's great to be here.
We're going to talk about a lot of different things today. I want to start with a high-level question about venture capital and technology startups. And that's the question of cyclicality. So Silicon Valley is often referred to as a place where there is cyclical patterns of investment. When the capital markets are great, a lot of investment goes into startups. When the capital markets are not so great, not so much investment goes in. And I'm wondering how much of that is still true, because the cost of starting a company has gone down dramatically, largely due to AWS and other cloud providers. And so there's not as much upfront capital cost to building a technology company. So I'm wondering to what degree cyclicality still exists in the technology startup landscape.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with you. I think the costs have come down a lot over the last few years. And as a result, I think what's happened is there's still cyclicality later stage. So when you're talking about like the Series C or Series B investors, like if they've tightened their belts, then it's much harder to raise those rounds. And then I think the companies at those stages have a harder time. I think at seed stage, a lot of times you might just need a couple $100,000 to start a company, or maybe even less. Whereas, 5-10 years ago, maybe you needed 3 million or 5 million. And so companies can often find that kind of capital through friends, family, like angel investors. So I think that part is getting a lot less cyclical, where there's just always kind of like angel capital around at that stage.
Mm-hmm. You worked at LinkedIn early on, and then you helped build a company called Factual. Tell me about your experiences building these companies and how that has impacted your perspective as a VC.
I think I learned a lot of valuable lessons at both companies. So both of them, I was pretty fortunate. I was at each company at kind of like the 15 to 50 person stage. And at LinkedIn, a couple of the things I learned are, so one was kind of counterintuitive to me. I didn't know anything about startups when I joined. This is like back in 2003. I'd heard a lot about how startups have, these crazy work weeks. And I remember talking to the co-founders and asking them like what are the work hours like? And they actually told me that, they had a lot of good work-life balance. It would be kind of like a 40, 50-hour a week job. And it was. And so I was really surprised that I think today there's kind of this mantra of like, you got to be working 100-hour weeks. You got to be like, like no family life, nothing outside of work. And I think, it's harder if you spend less time on your job, but I think you can succeed even with like a reasonable schedule. And I think LinkedIn showed that to me. I think a couple of other things I saw there that were really valuable is they really used A/B testing heavily in the early days. And it was just amazing to see the differences where, you try some invite message. And this is back in the days where people didn't know what social networks were. And so like we kind of had to explain to people like, what's a social network? Why should you sign up? Like, what is this invite? And the differences between like the best and worst invites would be, like 5% versus 15 or 20%. And it was amazing that you could basically like, without improving the product and just changing the text a little bit, you could have like a 3x or 4x improvement. And I would say the last thing I've learned, although I've kind of learned this since leaving there, is the value of like a competitive moat is just really, really high. And, a competitive moat, when I say that, what I mean is like kind of a sustainable competitive advantage. So that's kind of what my seed fund focuses on. These are usually things like network effects, economies of scale, maybe proprietary data. And I think when you have one of those things, like a lot of times it gives you a lot of flexibility as you build your business. And so we see this with LinkedIn today where, a lot of people aren't happy with the product, but it's still like so dominant and there's no one close to unseating it because like the network effects are so strong. So that was a really valuable lesson for me. And in terms of working at Factual, so Factual, if people are not familiar with, is a location data platform. So they aggregate listings on businesses. So like, the cafe next door or the vet next door. They aggregate that data from across the web, they clean it up, they dedupe it, and then they'll go sell it to both ad tech companies who want to use that data for targeting or mobile apps that want to show you places nearby. I think the biggest thing I learned there is, it's really important to launch fast. So I think Factual was really well funded from the early days. And as a result, it took a while to launch our first product. And I think we spent a while on it and like the technology was amazing, the software was amazing. And then when we launched it to market was kind of like, like this is nice, but we basically built tools for people to curate clean data sets. And what the market said is like, these tools are nice, but what we really want is clean data sets. And so we don't want to pay for the tools, but if you use them to like build these data sets yourself, we'll pay for the data. So that was an interesting lesson for me.
Now, do you think back to that when you're sizing up how much money to invest in a company these days because you maybe don't want to give them you want to give them an amount that's small enough where they still feel like they're on death ground and they have to fight to get their customers, they have to fight to get their product out the door really quickly.
Yeah, I think it's a lot like, kind of the Goldilocks principle where too much is not good and too little is not good. Too much money can be okay if the founder's experienced. So I think that was definitely the case with Factual where like the CEO had a lot of experience. I think he actually did a really good job managing the money. And, the company's still around, they're doing pretty well. But in general, I think it's almost like building an engineering team. Like if I have a task for you that, requires 5 engineers, if you get 4 engineers, like it's kind of stressful, but you can probably do it and everyone will kind of be at the top of their game. If I give you 1 engineer, like you're probably screwed. And if I give you 50, like you're also probably screwed. And so I think there's sort of like a right level, which is, you want it to be proportional to like what the company has to do in the next year and a half. And you don't want to give too much more than that or too much less than that. Mm-hmm.
So when you're going to make an investment, you make pretty sure where that money is going to be allocated in terms of increasing headcount, or maybe it's usually just increasing headcount, right? It's not like in technology companies, it's not or buying real estate space. It's not so much about expensive cloud services or something, right? It's usually human capital.
Yeah, I'd say most of the time, most of the expenses are human capital. A little bit goes to rent, a little bit goes to cloud services or infrastructure. That can go up a little bit if maybe you're doing something with, a lot of GPUs or a lot of cloud compute, but it's pretty unusual. But yeah, and a little bit on marketing depending on what the startup's doing. But most of it's headcount.
You have written about discomfort, that the underlying cause of failure for many companies is because founders are afraid of discomfort. And I think this applies to not just founders, but employees at big companies. Pretty much, I think, most people in the United States, probably people who are listening to this podcast at least, I think there's probably a bias towards people who are averse to discomfort in a way that may disservice them. Why is building a startup uncomfortable? And then maybe more broadly, why is discomfort useful for engineers?
Yeah, so maybe I'll tackle the second part first. I think a lot of times discomfort is useful because, the right thing might not be something you're familiar with or something you've done before. And so you're kind of uncomfortable trying it. But just because you're uncomfortable, like if you don't do it, then that means you're not doing the right thing. So where I've seen this play out in startups is, probably a couple different categories. So one is I think people avoid discomfort just because, they have a comfortable path and they're already used to it. And so they just kind of stick to it from inertia. And so on the engineering side, maybe it's like you have a framework you like and it's not the best framework for your next project, or it's not the right framework for your next project, but you just use the one you already know. And sometimes that's fine. And other times like it really bites you later. Or, another example would be maybe you hire like a few friends because you're friends with them and not because they're the right people for like the team you're trying to build. So that would be one category. Another category would be, people are, sometimes something's discomfortable and you just don't even want to do it, like firing somebody. And so you just don't do it. And then the problem is like everyone suffers, like the person you should have let go, the whole team, like, morale, like everything. And so I think there's a lot of examples of that. And I think the last thing, and I think this applies especially to startups, but also like to founders, but also to engineers, is at a startup, your role is always evolving. And so you kind of have these transitions where just as you get good at something, you have to try something else. So, maybe as a CTO in the first year, you're coding a lot, and then suddenly you have to transition from coding to management. And a lot of people, they don't like that change, or maybe they're not good at that change, but you kind of have to do it. Otherwise the company can't scale up very much. And maybe another year or two later, now you're going from managing contributors to managing managers, and it's another change. And so I think people kind of deal with these kinds of transitions all the time, and you really have to step up and do them. Otherwise, like the company stalls or your project stalls.
How should a leader, especially at an early company, impose discomfort on the employees to ward off potential complacency?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this is about setting aggressive deadlines where they're reachable, but they're not easy. And I think it almost goes back to this Goldilocks principle with fundraising, where, if a project takes a month, like maybe set a deadline that's 3.5 weeks. If you make it a week, like, then that's just unrealistic. If you make it 3 months, then like, people are not they're going to get complacent rather than uncomfortable. So I think you want to set that aggressively. I think actually one company that did this while I worked at Google for a few years on their fraud detection team. And over that time, I watched Google set OKRs, and I thought the way they did it was actually really elegant. They would have people set OKRs, which are these quarterly measurable goals. And they set this expectation that every quarter you should be doing something like, you should be finishing 60 or 70% of your OKRs. And the expectation was if you're finishing 100%, your goals weren't ambitious enough. But if you're finishing 20%, then it's the opposite, like you overreached. And so they kind of set this expectation where, we don't expect you to finish everything because we want you to be ambitious, but like you should be hitting most of your goals. And I thought that was a really nice balance.
Do you do that personally? Do you set your own goals in a way where you're going to try to just accomplish 60% or 70% of them?
I wish I was that organized and disciplined, but I actually don't.
What kinds of goals do you set for yourself? Or maybe internally at SUSE?
I mean, there's kind of this high level goal, which is vague, which is like, we just want to be a top seed fund. And so I think it's just kind of doing whatever I can to contribute to that. And I think, unfortunately, like the job has such irregular time demands where there's weeks where I have like 15 hours of work and there's weeks where I have 100 hours of work.
Yeah.
That it's hard to plan things. And so I think what happens is like whenever I have free time, I'll try to, do something that I think will help level up the fund. But I haven't been super like methodical about it. And actually talking to you makes me feel like maybe I should think about that some more.
So when I think about early stage venture, it sounds like the most discomfort probably comes from turning down people who are coming to you for money. Or where's the biggest source of discomfort at a seed stage fund?
I would say short term, that's the most unpleasant thing in terms of just like the actual tasks I have to do. I think saying no to really smart, passionate people is really tough. I think for me, actually, what's harder is that there aren't really good feedback loops in venture capital. So I make an investment today and, I probably won't know if it's the next, Uber or Google for 5 or 10 years. And so what happens is for that next 5 or 10 years, I'm just, I'm second guessing the investments I did and also second guessing the investments I didn't do and wondering like, am I actually picking well? And I think a lot of investors have this challenge as well.
And in terms of scaling up a company, so you saw a scalable measurement of discomfort at Google. The idea that you set OKRs, objectives and key results, every quarter, and you try to set them for yourself in a way that's ambitious enough that you're only going to be able to accomplish 60% or 70% of them. That I can think of as one source of discomfort. I can also think of Amazon as a company that seems to have a level of discomfort within the employees. I worked there, and so I saw some of the internal policies that contributed to this. You've certainly seen the New York Times article that talked about the level of difficulty, but on the other hand, you've seen the power of Amazon from its ability to scale that discomfort among its employees, or at least that's one of the sources of power. What are other ways that a large company, let's say there's somebody who's a CTO at a large company and they feel like their company is moving slower than they would like to, or they feel like there's more complacency in the organization. What are ways that you can impose discomfort in a company that's at scale?
So I think one potential way of doing that is to set, a big, hairy, audacious goal. And I think if you kind of align the company around this idea of, we have to bet the farm on some trend, right? Like whether it's the internet or cloud computing or, maybe it's like the direction of AR hardware. I think that can get people really...
Azure is a perfect example of this.
Yeah. So I think Microsoft's actually done this pretty well in the last few years. But I think if the whole company feels like, they're sort of in this do or die moment and they really have to perform, I think that's a really good way to like get people off their butts and working really hard. Obviously, there's this risk that, you make that big, hairy, audacious goal and like you don't reach it or it's the wrong goal. But I think it's definitely a good way to rally people.
Now, in talking about discomfort at startups, so you already talked about the fact that it's often going to be uncomfortable to fire a friend or to fire somebody who was there early on and they haven't scaled up to their role. And this happens a lot. Like at 5 or 10 people, the company is just not the same as it was at 2 or 3 people. And perhaps there's somebody who was doing a great job at the 2 or 3 people stage, but they have not scaled to 5 or 10 people, or maybe to 100 people. Why does this happen so often?
Yeah, so I haven't seen this too much in the very early stages, like when it's, 5 or 10 people. I've definitely seen it more and more as the company grows, because I think that's where the shifts in what people are working on are more and more dramatic. I think a lot of it happens over, I mean, there are different reasons. So I think one reason is sometimes people don't like certain stages of a company. Like I wasn't a founder, but every time a company I was at hit kind of like 40, 50 people, I started feeling ants.
My cat is clawing at Leo's chair.
Every time the companies I worked at kind of hit 40, 50 people, or the teams kind of hit, 25, 30, I sort of started feeling like, okay, I need to do something smaller again. And I've met founders like this where, it's literally their 6th or 7th startup, and they just message it up front. Like, I really like the V1 phase. I'm going to work on this for a year and a half or 2, and then go find a replacement CEO. And, I think they just they know what they like, or they know what they're good at, which is actually the second thing, which is sometimes people like a certain phase. Sometimes they're only good at a certain phase, and they know that. And so,
well, talking about why this happens so often, why you have this churn at 5 or 10 people, or you always have this churn at 100 people, these people who can't scale into certain roles.
Right. So, yeah, I think partly sometimes people don't want to do something, partly they're not good at something. I think when they're not good at something, like maybe, for example, you're moving from being an individual contributor to a manager or a director, people will try to level up, and sometimes they succeed and sometimes they don't. And I think the truth is, like, at some point, the founders have to think more about what's good for the company and the employees and the customers and everyone else. And so, it might be that you're in this tough spot where you have a friend and, you've worked with them for the last few years, and you don't want to end that, the working relationship. But if that means that like the company might go under and, 30 people that work for you might lose their jobs, like, I think that's something people have to really deal with head on.
Now, we've been talking at pretty high level about interpersonal aspects of startups. Are there discomforts that you see in the early stage that result from engineering issues too?
I think the biggest one I've seen is probably this tension between kind of like overbuilding or building for high quality versus trying to get to market faster. And I think as an engineer, I really want, I like high quality code. I like building things that are like robust and scalable and all these other things. And I think in practice, what I've seen is like that stuff rarely matters compared to just launching something and iterating on it very quickly. Because in a seed round, you might get, 12 months, 15 months of time to actually go launch something, find product market fit. If you launch in a month and then you can iterate on something new every month, you get 15 at bats. If it takes you 5 months and then, you're iterating every 3 months, you're going to get 3 or 4 at bats. And so in the first case, you're just much more likely to succeed. And then if you do succeed, then you'll have more capital, you'll have people wanting to work for you, and then you could clean things up. And so as an engineer, I find that pretty unsatisfying, but I think from a business perspective, it's usually the right way to go.
PayPal is famous for the level of argumentation and discomfort that existed on an interpersonal level within the company, but the people really enjoyed the fact that there were so many arguments, that they were heated. Do you find that is that a trend at companies where there is this level of interpersonal argumentation, or people with strong opinions battling back and forth? Like, at what level is interpersonal discomfort at a company healthy?
So I think PayPal, to me, at least what I've read about it, feels pretty different than the companies I've worked with. And it's hard for me to answer this question because the truth is, I meet with founders a lot, but I'm usually not sitting in their office day to day. So for all I know, they could be fighting all the time, although I don't think they are. But my impression is the best companies, they're very open. And so I think they try to have these cultures of transparency and openness and respect. And I think that definitely means people can argue, but I think they try to keep it more civil. And so the idea is, if people disagree, they really, it's not that one person should shut up because they've been at the company less long or they have a different title. It's more people should speak up, and then they should try to, figure out their differences, figure out the best approach in a civil way. I haven't seen the PayPal dynamic that much, although, I'm mostly kind of looking as a semi-outsider at a lot of companies.
So as a VC, discomfort is often caused by different kinds of risks. You have a pretty good talk about this called De-risking Your Startup, where you break down the risks in a mathematical way that was really appealing to me. What are the risks that a startup should try to eliminate or at least quantify?
So I think quantifying is the most important thing early on. And maybe not even quantifying in a mathematical sense, but just trying to figure out where your risks are. Because I think the way I think about the startups, like the success of a startup is almost like it's just a bunch of change probabilities, where it's kind of like there's going to be a 10% chance of, finding the right co-founder. And then there's like a 50% chance you'll build the right product, and, a 30% chance you can sell the product once you build it. And so there's all these different areas where, there's hiring, there's management, there's what product you have, there's what the competition does. And each of these is like, an opportunity for your company to fail, unfortunately. And I think what I see sometimes, and it pains me to say it, I see it a lot actually with technical founders, where people will kind of focus on the things that aren't really risks. And then it ends up, they're sort of surprised a few years later when investors don't give them credit for that and don't want to like put more money into the company. Because what will happen is, for example, you have two really talented engineers that are starting a company, and they're pitching a product, and the VCs, or investors are talking to really like the product. And, the question in the mind of the VC is like, well, I'm sure you can build this, but if you do, like, can you sell it? And then what will happen is, like, a lot of times the engineers will build the product for a year and they'll be like, look, I built it. And the investor's sort of like, well, like, I already knew you could do that. Like, the thing I really cared about is, could you sell it? And there's been like no progress on that. And so I think it's really important to sort of assess where your risks are. And it's, there's these common categories like recruiting or hiring, also management. Some risks are more industry specific. Like, for example, if you're doing something with healthcare, usually like, how do you get the sales going, and how do you work with all the incentives of, like, the doctors, the hospitals, the insurers, the patients, all these parties. So sometimes the risks are more industry specific like that, but it's good to really enumerate them and try to think about, like, what here is actually risky, what is not very risky. And then whatever is the riskiest thing, usually kind of like, you want to swallow the frog, to use that expression.
If you want to start a podcast, check out Podsheets.
Podsheets is a product we built to create and manage podcasts. We are podcasters ourselves, and we understand the difficulties of getting started.
You have thought about starting a podcast, but there are so many questions.
Is it expensive to get audio equipment?
No, it's not. You can get a decent mic for $20, or you can get started with just an iPhone headset.
Is it hard to get a good quality audio recording?
It's actually easy. We will show you how to record your audio and get good fidelity.
Okay. How do you edit an episode?
We will teach you how to edit an episode, or to help you find an editor who will edit your episode for $5 or $10 per episode.
And then how do I post my episodes? How do other people get access to them?
Podsheets makes it easy to post your episodes and distribute them to iTunes and Google Play with a single click.
If you're curious about podcasting but have no idea where to start, Podsheets will guide you through the process.
Podsheets is built by podcasters for podcasters. With Software Engineering Daily, we've been producing 5 shows a week for 2 years. We understand recording, we understand how to produce your show, and we understand how to get advertisers. We want to help you with this process.
Check out Podsheets today. We will give you everything you need to create and manage your podcast. And if you have any questions or get confused, you can always contact us directly for help. Podcasting is as easy as blogging. Let us show you how to podcast with Podsheets.
Yeah, so the mathematical expression for this that you have in the de-risking your startup talk is basically, if you have, let's say you're an investor and you're looking at a company, and there's the healthcare. So if it's a healthcare company, it's like, okay, can you sell this to doctors? Let's say you need to sell it to doctors, you need to sell it to insurers, you need to sell it to customers, and you need to build the software. And if there's a 70% chance of the first one, 60% chance of the second one, 80% chance of the third one, 40% chance of the fourth one, it's the product of those 4 scenarios. If you as a VC are evaluating the successful potential outcome of that business, it's the product of those 4 probabilities times the potential upside for that investment. So that's how you get to an expected value as a VC. So for people who didn't understand that explanation, describe why companies with, let's say 2 companies are going after the same market. Explain why those 2 companies might have different expected values of success.
Yeah. So first, I think your explanation is exactly right. I think, to use a really simple example, if there's a 50% chance you can build the product and a 10% chance that you can sell it to a doctor, if you take the 50% to 100%, you doubled your valuation. But if you take the 10% to 100%, you've 10x your valuation. So there's a lot more impact on focusing on the harder thing. And then in terms of companies at early stages, you might have a couple of companies where if they succeed, they might be, $1 billion outcomes or public companies. But in the early stages, they might look very different. So, for example, maybe one company already has a CTO and the other one has, a business co-founder who needs to somehow find a good CTO. And that's a big risk because, if you're not technical, it's really hard to interview technical people. Just like I know from my experience being technical, it's hard to interview non-technical people. You kind of don't know what to ask for. You don't know how to calibrate good candidates. So even though these companies might have kind of a similar outcome if they're both successful, one might have a much higher probability of success than the other one. And I guess I would say that's one difference that people sometimes don't think about, which is in public markets like the stock market, your valuation is based on your revenue and your growth rate mostly. So, if you have $200 million in revenue and there's like a 5x multiple on companies, your valuation's $1 billion. At seed stage, there's no revenue, there's no product, sometimes there's barely a team. And so instead of the valuation being based on revenue and growth, it's just more based on potential and probabilities. And so that's when investors are thinking well, this company has a 1% chance of being a $5 billion company. This other one has a 3% chance. So the 3% one should be worth 3 times more. But it's really based more on these risks and probabilities rather than traction.
So I listen to Jason Calacanis' podcast a lot, and the thing that he always says is that he's just placing bets on founders. And I think probably there's also some element of market and so on, especially if he doesn't know the founder. But if he believes in the founder, he's basically will throw money at any idea, or at least this is the way he presents himself. Do you agree with so? But I think he invested at kind of a different stage, a little earlier stage than a seed stage fund, because he's doing angel investments, which I guess is 50 to 250K checks. Well, to what degree how do you see that perspective? Do you think that's just an alternate perspective to the way that you approach it? Because it sounds like market risk is a big deal to you, and as market risk, execution risk, as well as how good is this founder?
Yeah, so I would say I agree with Jason on the part that founders are really important. And so I think that's often, the main criteria when we're deciding whether to invest or not is what do we think about the founder? Do we think they're capable of building whatever they want to build? But on the flip side, I think where I don't agree is kind of going back to maybe a mathematical way of looking at this. I think launching a product, it takes a few months usually, maybe 3 to 5 months to go launch your MVP and try to get some data on it. And if you have, let's say 15 months of runway, you basically have 3 or 4 shots of that. And so if I think you're a great founder, but I don't think your idea has promise, I know you're going to waste at least one of those shots. And maybe it's 2. And so I'm looking at a lot of companies that they'll have 4 shots and you'll have 2. To me, that means, either I think your valuation should be half as much, or maybe that's more risk than I'm willing to take.
Interesting. And is it also... So, and from his perspective, he's always saying, it doesn't matter if this one doesn't work out, because then as long as you let me be the first money in on your next investment, if you're an awesome founder. So if you were playing that kind of game, it seems like it would be okay for you to, even if you had a 50% chance with this person because they have 4 at bats and they're gonna brick on the first 2. If you take the longer term, if you're just investing in the founder, wouldn't it make sense to put money down just to potentially get into whatever their future situation is? Or is the deal, I guess, if the top of the funnel is so big that you have many people who fit that qualification, you still want to go with this type of person that's going to have 4 at-bats versus the 2 at-bats for the present scenario?
Yeah, I think you touched on an interesting point, which is the funnel. And I definitely feel like there are a lot of really smart, ambitious, amazing people out there. And, as an example, I think for a while, I used to get impressed when I'd hear oh, this person was, employee 8 at Instagram or, employee 15 at Uber. But I think if you do the math and you just list well, what are all the unicorn companies and, the first 25 employees at each of them, that's 3,000 people or something. And so I think the numbers are bigger than people realize. And I think the other part is if I don't like someone's idea, or it's actually less about not liking, it's more I don't think it's an idea that'll be a good business. I think in those cases, actually saying no and giving good feedback doesn't disqualify me from their next idea. Because if anything, I found that, if I give people a good reason and I say like, hey, for example, like you're building a company that, is a marketplace for, I don't know, like pets or something, and I don't think it'll work for reasons A, B, and C. And then first, most people appreciate that kind of directness. And on top of that, in a year or two, if it turns out that reason B was right and the startup didn't work for that reason, there's a good chance they'll come to me and be like, hey, I really appreciated the feedback. Now I'm doing like a new startup, like, I'd love to chat with you. And so I definitely feel like saying no to somebody hasn't disqualified me from, their future ideas or their future companies.
So whatever idea somebody is working on, there is a bundle of risks known as execution risk. What are the different types of execution risk, and how do you think about that as an investor?
So I think for me, execution risk, it's a little hard to describe, but I think it's kind of the things that are more in your hand and less, or like the things that are more in your control and less about trial and error. And so I think, for example, like trying to find product market fit, like you have an idea, but you kind of have to just go test it, and maybe you get lucky, maybe it takes a few tries. But then there's things like, well, you have the right idea and you have the right market, but like, can you actually build it? Or can you actually hire the people, to build it? Or things like that, where those things should be in the founder's control. And if you're not doing a good job on those, then you're not executing well. Hiring is an example, building good software, but launching it quickly, managing people as you scale up. A lot of these places are, if you do them well, then they just work. But if you don't do them well, it can really stall a company that would have worked otherwise. And so I think for me, that's what execution risk is.
So a best practice that you suggest is to focus on the biggest risks. You already talked about this. I think this is another thing that's important in business as well as in life. Oftentimes, you have a number of different things that are going on that are stressing you out or that are difficulties. And oftentimes it's important to just take a step back and focus on the thing that is the biggest risk or the biggest problem in your life. So as a VC, what are the biggest risks? What are the biggest? Is it within LPs, or is it in selecting the right businesses, or is it in not missing out on the right businesses? Tell me about the biggest risks that you have as a VC.
I think the biggest risk for most investors is probably on the picking side, picking companies, that is. I think the biggest challenge, which I mentioned before, is the feedback loops are just so long. And so you don't know for 5 or 10 years whether you picked companies well. And even when you do know, like you sort of know that, well, you picked them well 5 or 10 years ago, and then the technology has changed and like the landscape's changed a lot. So maybe whatever criteria you were using back then no longer applies. So I think that's something that, I and all the VCs I know think about a lot. I think it's less important to get into every good deal. It's more important to just make sure you're at least sometimes getting into good deals. With most VC funds, like usually the best 1 or 2 investments will be, 50 or 75% of the entire fund return. And so, you don't need 10 of them, you just need 1 or 2 to have a good fund. So you could, if you invest in Airbnb and pass on Uber and Dropbox, like you're still going to be really happy. But picking is definitely the hardest part, especially because seed stage, like there's so little data. A lot of times it's the founders. Sometimes they have a prototype, sometimes they don't. Sometimes there's a tiny bit of revenue, sometimes there's no revenue at all. So I think just like thinking about decision-making criteria, trying to be disciplined, trying to compare notes with other investors and make sure you're not missing anything. I think those are all, really important. I don't have a great answer for how to do this well because no matter what, like the feedback loops are long. But I think the thing I've tried to do a lot is to really track companies, both that I've invested in and that I've passed on, to see, which ones succeed, which ones fail, which ones kind of half succeed. And then, try to suss out like what are the differences between those companies.
Any insights that you're coming to from, even though it's just been like you haven't really gone through enough of a time frame to get that feedback loop? Are there any insights you're having just from the early results of the companies?
Yeah, so I think there are 2 I've seen so far. One is, I don't like this term, but I think charisma is really important, and it's not a word I like because I think it has can have a little bit of a negative connotation. But I think the best founders. Founders often have to like sell to lots of different people. So they're always, they're selling prospective hires on joining, they're selling to investors, fundraising, they're selling to prospective customers. And so I think the best founders are like people where when others meet them, they just think, wow, like I really want to work for this person. I really want to invest in them. I really want to, buy their product. And so I think that's like that's been a skill that just, kind of is just a multiple in startups. And then the other thing I've seen, probably more for B2B companies than B2C, is when founders are going after some niche vertical, like, they're selling whatever, like power plant management software or something. The best founders are the ones that know something about the vertical. I think it's really hard if, you're trying to sell power plant software and you've never worked in a power plant and you don't know how they work and you think you'll figure it out, versus, if you spent 10 years in the industry, like, the CEOs of a bunch of big companies in the space. A lot of our best investments that are B2B have founders that like really know their market before they even start.
So in order to effectively go from an engineer to an investor role, you need to take your technical expertise, whether that's in distributed systems or data science or APIs, and you have to layer on knowledge of human psychology. So you have to figure out how sales and marketing and psychology and finance, how those things match up against the technical expertise. I think you could be an expert in either the sales and marketing, the finance stuff, or in the engineering stuff, but it's obviously best if you have at least some familiarity with all of these different spaces. What are the domains where you feel like you need to shore up your intelligence, whether it's sales and marketing or psychology or finance? How have you found a way to layer the knowledge of those areas on top of your knowledge of the technical space?
Yeah, so I can give you a couple examples of this. I guess as a preface, I'm a very stereotypical software engineer. So, I like numbers and symbols much more than people usually. we actually, I had a joke with my partners before where every time there was like a networking event, they used to live in LA and New York and I was here. And whenever there was a networking event here, I'd ask them if like either of them were planning to visit here because I didn't want to go. But I would say in terms of my blind spots as an investor that come from engineering, so I can give you an example of one I kind of fixed, one I'm trying to fix, and one I don't know how to fix. So the one I fixed pretty quickly was I really overvalued tech when I was first starting out. So I think as an engineer, I'd sort of get excited about like a really elegant solution or a really cool product or like a really neat algorithm. And I think what I've learned over the last 5 years, now that I've worked with, dozens of companies, is the tech is almost never a bottleneck. So, usually when the founder says like, I'm going to build X, like they can usually build X. The problem is like, is X the right thing to build? Or if they build it, do they know how to sell it? Or like, can they build a good team around them? And so I think, I focused on tech a lot in the first few months, and then now I basically do very little tech diligence, if any. And I try to focus more on the business side. One thing I'm still working on is, because I like numbers, I tend to overvalue traction. So I think if somebody's got like really interesting numbers, I'll that weighs heavily on me. And I think a lot of times my partners will sort of remind me of, hey, this looks good in the short term, but we're trying to bet on like, could this be, $1 billion company someday? And sometimes I lose sight of that because like the immediate term numbers look good. So that's one I'm like always trying to remind myself of. And then one I don't know how to fix is I don't know how to read people well. And I'm really excited that my partners are good at it, because I think if I was by myself, I'd make a lot of mistakes. But they're much better at kind of sussing out, is this person charismatic, or like, like do they seem like they have good integrity, or do they seem like they're a hard worker? I'm okay at that stuff, but they're much better at it than I am. And I think maybe relying on partners is the only solution I have. I don't know how to fix it.
Talk a little bit more about that, like reading people, when and why that's important.
So I'll give you an example. So some founders are like really good salespeople, and they can pitch their idea well, even if there's like a lot of cracks under the armor. And I think if you're good at reading people, sometimes you could tell that somebody's trying too hard, or like they're trying to hide something. I tend to be less perceptive about stuff like that. Like it's just like I just don't see it as easily.
Okay. I want to talk about mistakes. It's summer 2017. Are there any common mistakes that you are seeing founders make as you're evaluating companies, as you're talking to engineers?
So I think a generic answer would be like the avoiding discomfort, but that has a lot of manifestations depending on the company and the founder. The two common mistakes I see on the fundraising side are twofold. One is probably more of a perennial mistake, which is I think founders that have an easy time raising a seed round often think a Series A will be easy too. And it's a very different ballgame, because the seed round is much more about kind of like your vision, your pitch, like, how well you can sell what you're planning to do with the company. The Series A is much more traction based, and like, what have you actually shown in the last year and a half? Like, what have you proven out? if I gave you $5 or $10 as an investment, do you know what to do with it? And so I think sometimes that's sobering for founders because, they're still trying to pitch on the vision because maybe they haven't made as much progress as they would have liked. But for Series A investors, that usually doesn't really resonate. So that's a more perennial mistake. And I think a more recent one is there's been just a lot of angel funding, more seed funds, more angels, more syndicates. So I think there's a lot of capital at that early stage. And so sometimes founders, they really value closing quickly instead of picking the best investors. And sometimes that works out and sometimes it doesn't. And I think the best way to think about it is it's a long-term relationship. It might be a 5 or 10-year working relationship. And so you really want to take time, like find the people that can help you the most, find people where you can talk to other founders they've worked with and they diligence well. And so I think that's something that, hasn't gone away, but more and more I'll see companies basically taking money from a lot of investors because the terms are good and the round is fast. And then later, they often end up regretting it.
So, you and I talked about this a little bit earlier. You said that when you were starting as a VC, you had a tendency to ask founders questions about engineering stuff because you come from an engineering background and you sometimes may have had gaps in the knowledge of sales or marketing, or just those questions didn't occur to you. How did you overcome the gaps in knowledge that might have led to otherwise mistakes that you ended up avoiding? Like, how did you learn to ask the right questions when you had those gaps in knowledge early on?
Yeah, so for me, by far, the most valuable thing I've had is good partners in the fund. So I have 2 partners, Chad and Seth. Chad's kind of been around the venture world through his family. His brother and dad are both in venture. So he's kind of been around that world for, his whole life. And I think he's picked up on a lot of things, through interacting with investors and founders and, learning from them, just kind of more through osmosis. And then on top of that, Seth had a really good long angel investing track record where he had angel invested in companies like Docker and Parse and Wish. And so I think the best thing for me to learn was just to take a lot of meetings with both of them and then just calibrate. And so, I would say I really like the tech here. And then, Seth would say, well, they have a lot of competitors and you should research them. And then, and I think the first couple of times he said that, I did the research and I was like, oh, wow, it's true. The tech is good, but this is such a crowded market. And so then I kind of learned to ask about that myself. Or, maybe Chad would tell me this founder had a certain characteristic in terms of it seems like maybe they don't have a strong work ethic. And if you ask a question like this, you'll see that. And so I think just doing meetings with other people really helped me a lot. I think if I was a solo investor, I'd probably be much worse at it. And I still don't know if I'm great at it, but I think I'd be much worse at it, if I never had a chance to learn from other people.
If you talk to somebody who's a founder and you get a perspective for their business and you're feeling really optimistic about it after having a conversation with them, and then maybe you have a second meeting with them and you ask them a question and some information comes out that's somewhat damning to their business, and it turns out that they were pitching a vision of their business through rose-colored glasses and it was a little, not entirely truthful. Is that negative signaling for you, or is that more like, oh, they're good at marketing, that's something that they should be doing at this stage? They should be, presenting their business through rose-colored glasses. To what degree should a founder be honest despite the metrics or the realities of their business?
My personal opinion is people should always be honest about this stuff. I kind of hate that there are so many good dating and marriage analogies to venture capital. But I think there's a good dating analogy here, which is, you want to be honest, but maybe some things you bring up later than others, right? And so, maybe something you bring up on the third date because after the first two, you feel like you know the person better, and so you'll be more understanding. So I think it's the same thing with, let's say, for example, a pretty bad scenario for a founder might be that your founder, your co-founder is on the way out. And so maybe that's not something you pitch in the first meeting, but you pitch the vision, you pitch what your plans are. And then if the person's excited in the second meeting, you can say let me reiterate on the vision and here are my plans. And just so you know, my co-founder is probably leaving. And so I'm looking for a replacement right now. And I think at that point, maybe you have the report and kind of the trust established that the investor is fine with that.
So around fundraising, you have given the advice that founders should not rush fundraising. So I've heard a lot of different pieces of advice on this. So some people say you should block out a few months of time where you're going to do nothing but fundraising because it's such a distraction, and you should completely serialize it. Other people say you can do it concurrently with building the company. You just have conversations with people, have it materialize organically. Do you have a strong perspective on this?
Well, first, I think this is why having multiple co-founders is really valuable, because usually maybe the CEO is fundraising a lot of their time, but the other ones can actually make progress on the company. In general, I do think, usually fundraising takes up a lot of time, but it doesn't take up all of your time. And there's two reasons for that. One is, investor meetings are usually 9 to 5. Like, you're not going to be meeting investors at 10 p.m. But a lot of times founders might be, coding at 10 p.m. or like doing some research at 10 p.m. So I think like most jobs, like, especially in the first year or two, like it's long weeks for a lot of people. And so, you might be meeting with investors for 20, 30 hours a week, but you're still also working like 30, 40 hours on the product on top of that. I definitely feel that way as a VC too, where I take a lot of pitch meetings in the day, but in the evenings I have a lot of work to do too. And like the evenings are free time for that because people don't want to, meet for a pitch meeting at 9 p.m. So I think that's one point. And the other point is, honestly, it won't take months of full-time work, because if you're doing like 30 pitch meetings a week for 2 months and you have no investors, like the problem's probably not that you're not pitching hard enough. It's probably that there's something about your pitch that doesn't resonate with people. So I think for most people, it might be like a couple weeks of like a really full out sprint, and then a lot of kind of like more sporadic follow-ups after that for, a month or two, and then hopefully around closes.
How does a platform like AngelList change the fundraising environment? Or how do you see it in the modern fundraising environment? How could technology founders use something like AngelList?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of another good option on the seed round side, right? Where I think a lot of times I've seen people, either fill out a round, or maybe like an investor can sort of make a bigger investment and a bigger impact on a company if they have a syndicate behind them. I've rarely seen AngelList sort of take a whole round. So typically, maybe a founder's raising $2 million, and, a lot of that's from funds and angels, and maybe, $300K is from an AngelList syndicate or something along those lines.
And how does that typically work? Like, is it like because I've heard the model is founders find a lead, and then the lead broadcasts to then the lead puts in like $50K, and then they broadcast to their investors, and then the investors, the other people in the syndicate put in another 250 or another 350 or something like that. Is that how it typically works? The lead basically puts in some amount of money and then signals to the other people?
Yeah. I haven't gone through the process myself, but I think that is how it works, that the lead basically makes a commitment, and then they talk with the founder about how much, basically how much room in the fundraising round the founder is willing to allocate. And then the angel investor will go and syndicate whatever room is left after their investment to their syndicate.
So I've heard a lot of interviews with VCs because, I think part of it is kind of the same thing what you said about founders is like, I think a lot of the best VCs are pretty charismatic, and they have interesting perspectives, and they see a unique top level view of the world. Like, new companies are coming to them, pitching them ideas. So investors often have this pretty interesting macro view. And that's one of I heard you on 20-Minute VC. I think that's one of the reasons why that show's pretty good, is because it's a unique perspective. You VCs do have a unique perspective on the world. The best VCs I find say things that are orthogonal to the norm. They say things that are pretty different. Is there conventional VC wisdom that you feel very at odds with?
So you're going to laugh, but I think the conventional wisdom I feel most at odds with is that you have to have like a really unconventional viewpoint on the market.
Okay.
And the reason I say that is because I definitely think that's true in public markets, because if you're trading a stock like, Netflix or something, you really need a different opinion from the crowd, and you have to be right in order to, sort of beat the market averages. I think it's very different for private companies, especially seed stage companies, because, having an interesting insight on a market is one way to have kind of outsized, abnormally good returns. But there's a lot of other ways to do well. For example, sometimes, every investor thinks an idea is good, and the idea is good. And the trick is not, do you see things differently? It's more like, this founder will have 3 or 4 slots for investors in the round, and there's 50 investors that are interested. And so it's more about like, can you stand out from that crowd? And so I've seen that with, a number of our companies, for example, are doing really well, and there's nothing really controversial about them. I think 1 or 2 of these you might actually, they might be good guests, but like as an example, there's a company called Scalyr, Scalyr, which does really fast log aggregation and management.
Actually, they just became a sponsor, so thank you for the intro. I got sponsorship out of that.
Awesome.
One of the reasons I paid for your coffee this morning.
Awesome. I got to get you more sponsors. So like one thing that's great about them is they have this really lightning fast log search product, log management and search. And I think if you pitch that to like investors or founders, it's like, hey, you have log search. Would you like it to be fast? No one says like, well, that's a contrarian idea. Like I'd really like slow. Like everyone believes that that's a good solution. And so I think there it's more about, did we meet the founder early enough, like before he filled out this whole round, right? Or like that was the example in that case. Another one was we invested in this company called Flexport. They're a really good company in the freight forwarding space. So they basically help other goods companies ship products from like China to the US, for example. And it had, a really popular seed round where a bunch of people wanted to invest. And I think we had the advantage of like, we had a nice warm intro. We met them a little bit earlier than a lot of other investors. And so there's nothing contrarian about it because like the founder is amazing. It was like his 3rd company in the same space. Like the first 2 were really successful. So I don't think anybody looked at that and said like, I'm not sure if this will do well. I think it's more like everyone thought it would do well. And then the question was like, how do you get in? And so I think there's this whole mantra of like, well, you have to be contrarian. You have to, see ideas differently than everyone else. But I think a lot of times it's more about, are you somebody that people want to work with, or can you make decisions like a week faster than the other investor? Or there's a lot of different ways to win in this game.
Mm-hmm. So Flexport, obviously a gigantic moat and a really hard business to build. So that's like certainly an appealing investment. The developer tool space, I think, is sometimes harder to evaluate. I mean, you look at a business like a Scalyr or a Periscope Data, which you're also an investor in, and what's appealing about those is it seems like they have really good unit economics because it's just a software business. It's easy to scale, and once you like Flexport, I know I read a testimonial from them about Periscope Data, and they were talking about how they built their entire business off of Periscope Data, so it's not going away anytime soon. But you look in the BI space, and there's tremendous churn. Right, like every 5 years ago or 6 years ago, Tableau was the hotness. Of course, Tableau is not going away anytime soon. People who have built businesses with Tableau are going to be customers for the long haul, but the business would not be as appealing to invest in today because there's Periscope Data and other Looker types of business intelligence tools. So does the amount of churn in the developer tool space, does that at all impact? So I guess, you have a moat in the sense that the people who are using a developer tool today, they're never going to throw it out completely. If you're a technology company that's doing really well and you're a Periscope Data customer, Periscope Data is part of your legacy infrastructure, you're going to keep using it forever. So in that sense, it's a moat with those customers. But there may not be as much of a moat in terms of growth. So your growth might cap out in 5 years when the BI tool space or the log management space changes. And then so if your customer growth changes, I imagine as an investor things would change. But maybe if you're just in the early space, you don't need to think about that. I don't know. Tell me a little bit how you think about moats in the developer tool space.
I think developer tools are definitely harder to work with in a long-term perspective for a couple of reasons. I think the biggest one is just I think developers are hard customers because more than other segments, they're really willing to try new tools. I think the unusual thing about them is they're willing to build their own tools. So I think if you sell like a sales solution to a salesperson, if they don't like it, they'll look at other sales solution, but they're not going to write their own like CRM, for example. But a developer might very well do that for some tool you're pitching to them. And so I think the bar is really high. And on top of that, I think companies are just starting to figure out how to repeatably and predictably sell to that segment. I think, with a salesperson, you go, maybe you go take them to dinner or something, right? I think for an engineer, like they often don't want to talk to people. Like they want to, they just want some online info and they want a demo that they can work on themselves. And so I think that piece of the market of like how you sell to that group is still developing. I think the moats come in different varieties. So one is I think developer communities end up being a pretty big deal. I think Twilio is a company that's done really well with that, or I think Stripe as well, where they have APIs, and I think their APIs hide a lot of complexity. But if somebody really wanted to, copy like the Twilio API, they could probably rebuild it on like, I don't know, $10 million or something. But Twilio just has so much mind share and love from the developer community that it would be really hard to displace them. I think for some companies like Scalyr, for example, where they do log management, you do get economies of scale sometimes. So, if as their costs go down for AWS, like storage and compute, they can offer they can price their service lower than somebody who's just starting out today and building the same product.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I think one area that a lot of, kind of on the community building side, one area that a lot of developer tool companies have really embraced is basically doing really good content marketing. Sometimes it's through meetups, but a lot of times it's having a blog on, like Periscope, for example, has a great blog on SQL optimization, kind of like advanced SQL usage, which is great because their customers are SQL analysts. And so I think they've become kind of like a good thought leader in that space, where if you're a SQL analyst, you kind of think of them as a company that, you're their core customer. It's not, someone in a different department. And I think that really resonates with people.
Mm. Every VC has an investment funnel, and in order to succeed, you need your investment funnel to at least have some interesting deals within it. Do you need differentiated deal flow, or can you just evaluate can you just somehow create the same deal flow that other people are getting and sort through it better than other people? How do you look at deal flow?
My personal opinions, I think proprietary deal flow is just going to slowly keep going away over time, as it has been for the last few years. I think is an interesting thought experiment. I think it's very unlikely that a founder would come and talk to me and not even try to talk to any other investor for a few weeks while they talk to me. Like, everyone does this in parallel. And, in the best case, maybe I get a few days head start because like they know me before, or like for some reason they really want my feedback over someone else's. But it's very hard to just have deal flow where, people go to you and no one else. And so I think because of that, it becomes more about, one, can you pick companies well? Two, sometimes like speed of decision making is really useful. I think I've actually seen this for engineering hiring as well, where it's like a really competitive market right now for engineers. And one of the best things companies could do sometimes is, if you interview somebody and give them a same day offer, and on the other hand, like they're interviewing with Google and it's going to, it's like a 7-week process and a lot of waiting. A lot of times people just, they love that conviction of you saying like, hey, like I met you today. That was great. Like, come work for me, start next week. So I think like speed of decision making can be a really big differentiator. It can also be, having a good brand and a good reputation, where there's a lot of founders that say, oh, you're a great investor to work with. And then they recommend you to their founder friends. Or like if you're talking to a founder and they do references on you, the references are great. I think that has a really large impact too.
So you write a lot about VC and programming on the Coding VC, which is your blog. Describe your thesis for that blog. What are you trying to accomplish with what you're writing?
So I think when I set out, I didn't really have a strong thesis. My main approach has just been that I think having an engineer's perspective on venture capital is kind of unusual. And so I thought it might just be interesting to jot my notes down as I sort of learned about the business over the last 4 or 5 years. And I think over time, where it's shifted to is I try to write actionable, concrete advice for people. And a lot of times it's sort of written as an engineer. So it's sort of like, here's an algorithm for this or a heuristic for that. And the way I think about it a lot is a lot of what motivates many of the posts is it's almost like refactoring or caching, where like if I give the same advice a lot of times in person, like I'd rather cache it and put it in a blog post, and then later, then it's kind of more scalable. Or if I see, lots of people making the same mistake, I can sort of think about it and try to come up with like a good solution. And that's kind of almost like refactoring, right? And then I post that, and hopefully that's useful to people. So that's kind of how I think about the blog now.
Are there any blog posts rattling around in your head right now that you want to put onto paper that you haven't yet?
So I have a couple I've been sort of collecting notes for years. So there's 3 that I'd like to publish over the course of the year. One is on pitch decks. So I've been wanting to do kind of a long series on pitch decks for a while, which really talks about, like for each slide, like here are the slides you should have in the deck. Here's what each slide should have. Because I think there's sort of, a lot of good patterns and anti-patterns for what to do and not to do. So I'd love to put that in a post. Another post I've been thinking about is, we've talked about moats a little bit. And that's actually my fund's focus. Like the kinds of companies we like to invest in are the ones where we think there's a good long-term moat. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of an overloaded term and people throw it around. And I'd love to do a series on kind of explaining what moats really are, like giving examples of them, like the types of moats, like network effects or economies of scale, giving examples of each of those types of moats, like explaining what the pros and cons are. And the last post that I've been working on for a while is, I've been in the industry for almost 5 years now. So I've just accumulated a whole bunch of like lessons and tips and, do's and don'ts from working with a bunch of other companies and investors. So I've been kind of thinking of writing a, 50 lessons in 5 years post or something like that.
Let's go deeper on moats. If I'm thinking about building a technology company, how do I find a moat? For let's say I just have a space that I'm interested in. How do I find a moat for that? Or how do you think about moats more broadly? Just give me a deeper explanation for how you think about moats, what that term actually means. I mean, obviously it comes from the Buffett school of thought. He talks about moats in his writing, and that's a big focus of his investments. What's different about your thesis on moats?
I'm not sure if it's different. I guess I would say I think my partners and I value them a lot more than a lot of other aspects of a business. And the reason we think about it that way is, as seed investors, we're investing in companies where it might take 6 or 8 years for a company to go public or get acquired for a large sum. And so in that time, like on day 1, nobody really cares about what you're doing. On day 1,000, where maybe you have like $10 million in revenue, there'll be some competitor in the space that starts looking at your company and thinking like, oh, that seems like, a good business and I have a lot of capital, like maybe I should try to get into that space. And so I think what we want to invest in companies where the bigger they get, the harder are for others to catch up to. And as I mentioned before, it could be network effects, it could be economies of scale, which means sort of like your fixed costs get spread over more and more products. So your cost per product goes down a lot. I think software businesses often have great economies of scale. And in terms of how we think about it, so on day 1, basically nobody really has a moat. And it's something you need to think about though, because when investors ask this question that's sort of cliche of like, well, what would you do if Google copied you? Like, people need to have a good answer. And maybe Google's not the competitor you're afraid of. Maybe it's Amazon, maybe it's another startup, maybe it's a big player and you're like, kind of more niche space. But at some point, like somebody will try to copy you. And a moat is basically the one way to guarantee you can keep like a sustained profit. Because if you think about it, if you have a great business and you're making like $1,000 per customer in profit, but it's really easy to copy the business, somebody will copy it and do it for like $500 in profit. And then someone else will copy it and do it for $200 in profit. And eventually, like, all of you are sort of like fighting for pennies. And I think if you have a good moat, you're making $1,000 per customer and the customers are happy. And on top of that, like your competitors, they really can't touch you because it's not economically feasible for them to do whatever you did.
You have a software project that you want to build. Everybody does. I love building products, but I know more about how software fits together than how to actually write the code itself. I don't spend a lot of time writing code, but I do like to build software. That's why I use TopTal. TopTal is the best place to find reasonably priced, extremely talented software engineers to build your projects from scratch. You can get a pair of Apple AirPods when you use toptal.com/sedaily to work with an engineer for at least 20 hours. And I recommend it. I think it's a great way to build your projects if you don't have time to build them yourself. There's a misconception that engineers have to build all of their own projects just because they're capable of doing that. It's not true. TopTal has only the top 3% of developers. They turn away 97% of the developers that apply to work on the TopTal platform, and that's how you get a matching process that's unlike anything else I have seen in the freelancer marketplace. And I've tried a lot of different freelancing platforms. TopTal has such high-quality engineers, and they listen through the design specifications that you have. They handpick the perfect developer for your project, and this has saved me countless hours in my development process. There's really nothing that compares to TopTal that I have seen. So you can get a free pair of Apple AirPods when you try TopTal at toptal.com/sedaily. Find an engineer that's going to help you build your side project and get your MVP off the ground. As long as you do at least 20 hours, you get those free Apple AirPods. And if you've already got a company that you're working on, you can also use TopTal to scale your team and get everything done faster and raise the bar for your engineering, or get through that blocker that's preventing your company from getting to the next level. So check out toptal.com/SEDaily and find an engineer who will help your project succeed. One of the most intriguing trends that is going on in the world is just the democratization of starting companies. And we're seeing China go from a place where it's copying American businesses to real innovation is happening there. So the really interesting businesses are being started in China. So you're an investor in Andela, right?
Yes.
Okay, so Andela is this African company that's basically makes it really easy to augment your team with African developers, but it's also more of an ecosystem. So it's creating an entire ecosystem of strong developers in Africa, and it looks like it's, probably eventually companies are going to come out of it somehow. It might be like a Y Combinator sort of app for Africa. What's going to change in the world when there are technology companies coming out of every area of the world? Because that seems to be on the horizon. So, is it going to be a positive sum environment where these companies are building off of each other and you get startups investing in startups? Or is there a point where it's more of a zero-sum sort of thing and the companies become hyper-competitive with each other? What's your long-term view on what the democratization of technology startup capabilities does to the world?
I'm pretty bullish on kind of the value for the world. I think basically just technology will accelerate and the quality of life will accelerate for people. I think for a lot of the startups I've looked at in other countries, what's really interesting to me is they have business models or approaches that just wouldn't really carry over to the United States or Europe. So for example, I remember about 6 months ago, talking to a really interesting company I was trying to build out basically a PayPal-like network in Africa. And what they were starting with was electricity bill payments. And so the way it works, if you're in Nigeria, for example, as far as I understand it, is if you have to pay your electricity bill, you go to the local electricity office, you stand in line and you give them $5 in cash. And they give you a code where the code says, okay, you now have an extra, this many kilowatt hours on your meter. And you punch that code into the meter. And then when that meter starts expiring again, you go to the office again, pay them in cash. And so this company, they wanted to basically build out this PayPal-like network for peer-to-peer payments. And the way they were trying to build out the network was to basically enable people to do electricity payments online or through their cell phones. And so it's an interesting model because, the initial product is not peer-to-peer at all. It's more like, hey, instead of going and waiting in line, why don't you just pay for this on your phone? But then once a lot of people are doing that, now you have a great network of people to go start a peer-to-peer payment service. And I think it's a really interesting idea, and I could see it working really well in Nigeria. I don't think that works at all in the US, for example, because people don't go to the local electricity office. So I think what happens is a lot of these local startups, they end up serving their own markets, and sometimes that can be internationalized, but a lot of times, maybe it's more of a market-specific solution or market-specific problem.
One thing I have observed talking to, particularly, so I've got a couple friends I made in Africa from interviewing them about these brothers that built this browser called the Crocodile browser. They were these teenage brothers that wrote a browser for Android. And talking to them, they are not afraid of discomfort. And that's something I've observed talking to other people from Africa too. You compare their work ethic and their attitude and their willingness to just build, work, solicit ideas, be humble. It so eclipses many of the people that are in Silicon Valley that I'm just I would much rather put money in these people if I could, just on the core level of the discomfort that they're willing to take on. Do you notice I don't know how much prospecting for deals you do outside of the United States, but do you notice a difference in maybe the level of entitlement or the willingness to take on discomfort in people who are in countries outside of the United States?
I think what I've noticed is in every country I've looked where I've met founders, like the best founders have that element to them. I think to your point, when I meet founders from Africa, it feels like pretty much all of them have that aspect. And then I think in the US, like some people do and some people don't. So there's a lot more variability. But I think kind of the best founders, kind of regardless of location, have that element. I think sometimes I'll see it where, I remember one founder I talked to, this is probably like 3 or 4 years ago. She was building this product that was basically try before you, it's called Lumoid. It's try before you buy for gear rental. And I remember asking her, there are a couple of competitors that tried something similar in the last few years. Like, why do you think they failed? What are you doing differently? And this is like 4 years ago. And I still remember what happened because basically, I think a day or two later, she reached out to me and said, well, like I tracked down the founders of both companies. I interviewed both of them. Like I figured out. And I think like that to me showed like kind of so much hustle. And honestly, it's probably like not an easy thing for people to do, to just like pick up the phone, go to a stranger, be like, hey, can you tell me why your business failed? And so I think I've definitely seen that element from some founders, and I've seen other founders that are sort of more, more laid back, and they're like, well, like I'm not sure why that company failed, or like, we're different. And then it feels a little bit more lazy sometimes. But I think the great founders are like, they're really hardworking, they're all in on their companies.
How much investment do you do outside of the United States?
We've done a little bit. So in the last almost 5 years, we've done about 60 investments. I think probably about 6 or 7 have been outside of the US. A lot of them are in Canada, which is kind of outside of the US, but certainly not as much as, it's certainly not as foreign as like Africa, for example. I think one area where I've struggled a little bit in the last year or so is we actually think the African ecosystem is really interesting. Yeah. We think there's a lot of potential there for like to build great companies. The challenge has been that Series A investors haven't seemed too interested in the space so far. And so I think we've kind of seen this challenge where, we'd like to invest in a company at the seed stage, but then we're, pretty worried that they won't be able to get funding at a Series A. And so I think we're sort of, for now, we've mostly been waiting to see, signs where Series A investors will, look at companies outside of the US a bit more. And I think as soon as we start seeing that, we'd love to invest more in some of those other countries and continents.
So you think it's because they're not looking, or does it have to do with that use, because of what you said about that PayPal-like business that's kind of potentially balkanized to, or wouldn't be able to scale beyond Africa?
Honestly, I think it's a mixture of like, and I feel this way too when I look at some of these companies. It's a mixture of like both discomfort and also feeling like I'm just like, I know so little about a market, because for example, like it took me a while to drill in on the Nigerian power market when I was looking at this company, or like the payments market. And I think if I was a VC in Nigeria, it would have been much easier because I'd be like, oh yeah, this is what I do day to day. And so I think one, investors feel like it just takes a lot more work to really learn a market like that. And on top of that, like it's hard to know if you really even know it, unless you live in the place. And on top of that, on the discomfort side, I think, there's a lot more uncertainty in investing in a company, like let's say in Africa right now, than there is in investing in like, a SaaS startup out of San Francisco. And so I think, for as long as there are enough really good SaaS companies in San Francisco, they'll probably keep getting a lot of VC dollars.
So we're in the midst of this cryptocurrency run up, and
cryptocurrency, what's that?
And so, well, what I find interesting about this is I don't think anybody knows, nobody can say, is this an overheated market or is this an entire shift of the financial system? So I'm curious how you evaluate that. I know I think I saw a tweet from you that was like your strategy for investing in ICOs is don't invest in ICOs. But an ICO is not the same as just investing in Bitcoin or investing in Ethereum. So anyway, what are your thoughts on this space, and how do you identify, what if this is a once-in-a-lifetime moment where the market just goes up and up and up and up, versus, like, how do you know if this is an overhyped space or not?
I definitely feel like it's overhyped. And then I think the challenge for me and a bunch of other people is knowing whether, it's overhyped in the short term. And the question is, in the long term, is this, kind of like a pivotal shift in how the world works, or is this going to be, like a tulip bubble or something? I think most people I've talked to feel like in the short term it's overhyped, and in the long term there is a lot of potential value here.
Yeah.
And so I think it's probably, in my mind, this is probably similar to like the crypto stuff right now is probably similar to like the bubble of 1999, where things are really overvalued. There's a lot of hype and, sort of like kind of unrealistic expectations. But on the flip side, I think, in 1998 or something, if you ask yourself, like, I don't know, if the valuations are good now, but do I think the internet will change the world over the next 10 or 20 years? That seems like a safer bet. But, if you had invested at the peak of the bubble in like 99, 2000, it would have taken you like 10 or 15 years to even get back to even with on your money. So I kind of feel that way less so about cryptocurrencies, but especially ICOs. I think there's a lot of regulatory risk. I think it feels like companies are raising so much money. We talked about like, is it important to raise too much or too little or just enough? And I think for a lot of these companies, maybe they've managed like 500 grand before, they managed 2 million and suddenly they get like 300 million. I just don't know if that's something people know how to, I don't know if founders can jump from that 2 million level to the 300 million level effectively. I think there's just a lot of risk just purely in that, right? I think it's almost like being a lottery winner. Like I think people don't spend extremely well when they win the lottery.
Yeah. So but some of this, I've heard is like the people who put in a bunch of money when Bitcoin was at 12 cents and now they're just flush with cash and they can just pour money into the cryptocurrency ecosystem, whether it's if it's ICOs at this point or if a new cryptocurrency comes out. And if there's people who have actually made enough liquidity and those are the investors in the cryptocurrency market, that seems like it creates a bit of a different set of conditions than the 1999 bubble because, well, I guess I don't really know. So I'm just thinking from the perspective of somebody who I have not put any money into cryptocurrencies. And at this point, I'm like, okay, I need to put some money in with a buy and hold thesis. The question is, should I put some money in now or should I wait for a dip? And I'm a little bit worried, like if I wait for a dip, it's just going to keep going up and up and up. So maybe I should just buy while it's too high for now. And because I'm putting in an investment on a 20-year time horizon, I don't know. I'm just trying to evaluate this from a personal perspective.
Yeah, so I'm definitely not a financial advisor, but I think this is a place where maybe dollar cost averaging can work a little bit. So, let's say you want to invest like $10,000, like instead of trying to pick the optimal time to invest $10,000, maybe you invest like $1,000 every 2 weeks for 5 months or something like that.
Oh, okay.
So I think that's one approach. What was the first part of the question?
No, that was it. That was it pretty much. Yeah. What about crypto hedge funds?
So the hedge funds are interesting. Again, for me, it's a matter of like market timing. So, I'm not sure if like buying a crypto hedge fund now is like buying a public stock market index in like, March of 2000, where, it's a good long-term investment, but if you enter at the wrong time, like, it might not be a good investment for like 5 or 10 years. Like in my mind, I think my gut feeling is like a crypto hedge fund would have been great a year or two ago, and it might be great a year or two from now as some of the dust settles and there's more regulation and there's more standards and best practices. I don't know if it's a good time now. I'm kind of skeptical that now is a good time, but it's also, it's often very embarrassing to predict the future in a recorded setting.
Yeah. Well, it's such a unique security, right? Because if you've read a lot of stuff about market psychology and market dynamics, do not get into cryptocurrency right now would be the conventional wisdom. But who knows? Maybe this is different. Maybe this is a different type of security. Maybe it's a different type of market.
So I think one thing that's interesting here is like, I feel like there's a lot of asymmetry on the upside and the downside. So like if you invest in Apple today, worst case, you lose your money. Best case, maybe you double or triple it over like 5 or 10 years. I think cryptocurrencies and angel investments and venture investments, they're a little different because in worst case, you lose all your money. In the best case, maybe it goes up like 100-fold, which you don't really see on the stock market. And so I think one good piece of advice I've heard from this pretty famous VC Chamath at Social Capital is, he recommended putting like 1% of your net worth into cryptocurrencies. I think something like that seems like an interesting idea because in the worst case, you lose 1%, which sucks. But, if it goes up like 30-fold or 100-fold over the next 5 years, maybe that means like you doubled your personal net worth. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a pretty interesting piece of advice, especially if you're kind of long-term bullish on, the value of cryptocurrencies and the blockchain and tokens.
So I want to wrap up with a little bit about SUSE and just how venture firms work from the inside. So different firms have different ways of deciding to do a deal. So some firms require consensus. All the partners have to agree. Some of them require only one partner to say yes. You can also have silver bullet policies where, let's say, normally you require consensus, but once a year, every partner gets to say, I want to do this deal, so we're all going to do this deal. How do you decide on whether or not to do deals at SUSE?
So we've iterated on this a lot. I think where we've come out at the current stage, and it might change again in the future, but where we are now is we want majority to like it. So at least, 2 out of the 3 partners, and then at least one of the partners really has to love an investment. We used to have veto votes that never got used. And this is, I talked about like the asymmetric returns for cryptocurrencies. Yeah. It's the same in venture capital where, a typical fund might make 30 investments and 20 of them will be like 0x or 1x or 2x. And then a couple might be like 50x, and it's the 50x's that matter. And so because of like, you're going to make a lot of investments that don't do well and 1 or 2 that do great, the vetoes don't work well because like blocking a bad decision is not the end of the world. But if you blocked a company that becomes 50x, like you sort of, you never forget. So we had veto votes. We never used them. At some point we decided like, well, we would just kind of log what everyone thought, even if somebody really doesn't like it. But we want at least one person to love it, and either the majority or everyone in the fund likes it. And we also, this is kind of an interesting study of human psychology. We had silver bullets a couple of years ago. Again, one of those things that never got used. We decided we'd have 1 per fund, and a fund's kind of a 3 or 4 year cycle. And I think what we found is, for the first couple of years, nobody wanted to use theirs because they thought, well, what if I find something better in the next couple of years? And then towards the end of the fund, it was too late because like we never found anything better.
There are several ways to scale a VC firm. You can start more funds. You can start verticalized funds. You can make bigger funds. You can get into later and later stage financing. You can build out a services firm like Andreessen Horowitz has, where they help companies with hiring or technical decisions. Or you can just refine your deal selection. You can just get better over time, and then your returns are presumably going to go up and they're going to scale. How do you plan to scale SUSE?
Yeah, so I think we plan to do a bunch of the things you mentioned. I think the 2 key ones are that we want to expand our team. That way we can meet with more companies. We can also get kind of like different insights from different, backgrounds and perspectives. I'm actually really excited. We just added our first investment team member a couple of weeks ago. Her name's Natalie. She comes from a different background than the 3 partners. So she comes more from the finance world. She worked at SVB for a while and Goldman Sachs. And I think it's been interesting because even in the first 2 weeks, like whenever we have meetings and, she's part of them, she asks questions that are different than what we would ask. I think we learn things that we wouldn't have learned if it was like, just the 3 original members at the meeting. So I think that's been really valuable. And we want to keep expanding our team with great people. We also want to add more and more services like a firm like Andreessen Horowitz. I think in venture, actually, there aren't too many moats, but one of them is, if you do the services model, it's not something that every fund can afford. And so kind of correlated to doing more and more services, like maybe if we were to hire an in-house recruiter or a PR person, is, we'd want the fund to get bigger so that we have more capital for paying for those services. And then the corollary is one of the other things you mentioned, which is bigger check sizes. And that is that as our fund does get bigger, so we can, pay for more employees, pay for more services, now we have to invest more in each company. Otherwise, if we're $1 million or $100 million fund and we put like $100K into a company, like no matter how good the company is, it just won't make an impact on the fund. So as the fund grows, the check sizes grow too.
Do you miss founding companies running companies and, I guess SUSE is obviously a company, engineering? Do you miss writing code or building systems?
Yeah, I think there's definitely aspects of it I miss. I think part of it's like kind of the immediate feedback loop where you can go into a REPL or you can write, like a little applet for yourself and, in a couple of hours, you could have something really useful where, a couple hours ago you had a blank slate. You don't get that much of that in VC because things just take years instead of hours. So I definitely miss that part of it. I think at some point when I first got into VC, I wanted to be a founder. I'd been at a couple of early stage companies where, there were a dozen people when I joined, but I didn't know much about the 1 to 10 person stage. And I got this opportunity to join a seed fund. And I thought, wow, what a unique opportunity. I can meet a bunch of founders in that 1 to 10 person stage and learn from them. And then maybe in a year or 2, I'll go start a company. And I think what happened over that year or 2 is, one, I figured out that while I missed engineering, I think I'd missed the VC side even more because I really enjoyed talking to, really smart people about their ideas, like really drilling in on their business models and their plans and their products. I think I also got, felt more and more imposter syndrome where like the founders I met were so good that I felt like, I thought I'd be decent, but I didn't know if I'd be as good as they were. And so, that was like, that 1 or 2 year plan was 5 years ago, and now I'm 5 years in, and I think it's, a lifetime career. But I think what I do like, and I think this is what you see if you go to like my blog, is I like thinking about a lot of venture from more of like an engineering perspective of like, refactoring or caching or like trying to look at things as algorithms or heuristics rather than, just kind of like winging it.
Well, it's funny. So that in poker, when I started playing poker, this was kind of 2005, 2006, over the next 3 or 4 years, it underwent a transition where the people who were making decisions based on feel or based on gut, based on these things that they couldn't quantify, these people just got systematically weeded out. And I've just believed more and more over time that if you can't put your thesis into crisp, concise, quantified, articulated terms, it might mean that you don't actually have a thesis at all, and there's something problematic about that. So, sounds like the coding VC is the way to go.
Yeah, I actually so I was into poker around the same years as you were, although
Okay.
I wasn't any good at it. But I still remember one of the players I watched on TV was Paul Phillips, and he's like I think he was a core Scala contributor for like a decade. But I remember he talked
the bald guy, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
But I remember he talked in a couple interviews. He talked a lot about like he was just like a pot odds, implied odds calculator. He knew all these like probabilities like the back of his hand, and I think that was part of what makes some of today's great players great is like they know how to bluff and all that, but they also know sort of like the numbers, the optimal game theory, and I think that's what makes them so hard to play against. Okay.
Well, Leo, it's been great talking to you. I think we should do another show in the future. This is great. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks so much, Jeff. I really appreciate you having me.
Thanks to Symphono for sponsoring Software Engineering Daily. Symphono is a custom engineering shop where senior engineers tackle big tech challenges while learning from each other. Check it out at symphono.com/sedaily. That's symphono.com/sedaily. Thanks to Symphono for being a sponsor of Software Engineering Daily for almost a year now. Your continued support allows us to deliver content to the listeners on a regular basis.
Wow!